Hi friends, today we're gonna talk about a new topic which is solving quadratic equations. In order to solve quadratic equation, there are many different ways to do it. For this session, I'm gonna explain the quadratic formula. So what is a quadratic expression? A quadratic expression is any algebraic expression in which the biggest power is 2, and then we could have a combination of first order x and constant. This is a function in terms of x, and it's a quadratic function because the biggest power is 2. When f of x is equal to 0, that means ax to the power 2 plus bx plus c is 0. So in that case, the function turns into an equation. Okay? When we have an equation, as I mentioned in my previous video, we are looking for specific numerical values for the unknown parameter. And here the unknown parameter is what? It's x, right? So because this is second degree, we expect two answers or two roots. So two answers or two roots or two solutions, they mean the same thing. Okay? And how to find it? Today we're going to talk about the quadratic formula. Okay, so by using the quadratic formula, we'll find the roots of a quadratic equation. Let's say the general form of a quadratic equation, it's ax to the power 2 plus bx plus c equal to 0. And then in order to find the roots, because we have two roots, x1 and 2 equals minus b, which is the coefficient, b is the coefficient of x, plus and minus b squared, the coefficient of x to the power 2, minus 4 times a, which is the coefficient of x2, and c, which is a constant, over 2 times a. Okay, so if you substitute all the values in this formula, you would get two separate values for the roots, x1 and x2. This formula actually, it's one of the best ways to find the solution, and it will, it's very easy to use, and it saves you a lot of time. And when you have the formula, you can also extract other information about the quadratic formula. Let's say here, under the radical, it's b to the power 2 minus 4 times ac. Okay, as we know, under the radical should always be either greater to 0 or equal to 0. If this thing under the radical is exactly 0, that means we would have two identical roots. Okay, well, I explain it later. But if under the radical it's greater than 0, so then we would have two different roots. But it could also turn out to be negative. So in that case, b to the power 2 minus 4 times ac, it's less than 0. In this case, there would be no real roots. Okay, so let's do a few practice questions and see how easy it is to use the formula. So I start by giving you an example, and then you can stop the video, try to do the example, and then resume the video and see the answer. So let's say solve x to the power 2 plus 3x minus 4 is equal to 0. I want to solve this through quadratic formula. So first thing first, I usually like to be really systematic when I'm doing math. So first I try to identify a, b, c. As I mentioned, a is the coefficient of x to the power 2. So a here is 1. B is the coefficient of x, which happens to be 3 in my example. And c is the constant number, which is -4. And now what I have to do next is just to substitute a, b, c in this formula. So it would be -3 plus and minus b squared, which is 9, minus 4 times a c over 2 times a, 2 times a. So under the radical, it would be 9 plus 16. So I will simplify it further. That would be radical 25 over 2. Okay, so this thing would simplify further to -3 plus and minus 5. So if I want to simplify it one more step, my x1 would be -3 plus 5 divided by 2, which would be 1. The x2 would be -3, -5 over 2, which is -4. So by solving this quadratic equation, I found 2 roots or 2 answers. And what does it mean? These are the 2 roots. So that means if I go back to my original equation and substitute the x as 1, it should equate to 0. Okay, so let's try it. X equal to 1. So let's see, x to the power 2, it's 1, plus 3 times 1 minus 4. And let's see if it equal to 0. So 1 plus 3 is 4. 4 minus 4 is 0. So that means yes, we've got the right answer. So let's try the other root. That's root number 1. Root number 2 is -4. Okay, so now let's substitute x as -4. -4 to the power 2 plus 3 times -4 minus 4. And let's see if it's equal to 0. So that would be 16 minus 12 minus 4. Yay, that's equal to 0. So that means both of the answers, both of the roots are correct. So remember, let's do a quick summary. Today we're going to do quadratic equations, how to solve quadratic equation using quadratic formula. First, I started by writing the general form of a quadratic expression. Then I turned it into an equation by equating to 0. And like any other equation, I'm trying to find specific numerical values for the unknown parameter, which happens to be x here. Because it's a quadratic, that means the biggest power here is 2. We expect 2 answers or 2 roots or 2 solutions. And how can we find it? We can just identify A, B, C and substitute it in the formula. If you look at the formula more closely, you would see that the formula has got a radical. As we know, the radical should always be either positive or equal to 0. If the radical is positive, that means there would be 2 different roots. The values would be different. But if the radical b squared minus 4 times ac is equal to 0, then we still have 2 roots, but then they are identical. If the radical is negative, it's less than 0, in that case, we wouldn't have any real roots. Okay, so let's do a few more practice questions because it's getting more and more interesting. The next one would be Okay, so another example. Let's start it here. Example 2x to the power 2 minus 4x minus 3 is equal to 0. Okay, and I want to find the answer through quadratic equation. So first, let's identify a, b, c. What is a? It's a coefficient of x to the power 2, so it's 2. B is the coefficient of x, -4, and c is it's the constant, right? So now I will rewrite my formula again. It's good for practice. -b plus and minus b squared minus 4 times ac over 2 times a. So the next step would be simply substituting. So it would be plus 4 plus and minus b squared 16 minus 4 times a c over 2 times a. So let's find the roots. Let's see what's the value under the radical. So it is 16 minus 8 times 3, 24. It's plus 24 plus 16 is 40. 40 over 4. So 40, I can write it as 4 times radical 10 because we want, from here, we're trying to simplify it. Okay, so 4 plus and minus 4 times 10 divided by 4. So radical 4 would come out of the radical as a 2. So I can say 4 plus and minus 2 radical 10 over 4. And then I can factorize a 2, right? And then go 2 plus and minus radical 10 and 4. So I can simplify this 2 with the denominator. And my final answer, simplified answer, would be 2 plus and minus radical 10 over 2. So the first root would be 2 plus radical 10 over 2. The second one would be 2 minus radical 10 divided by 2. And remember, for now, we are only trying to solve the quadratic formula, the quadratic equation through the quadratic formula. There are other methods as well, like factorizing or making it a perfect square. But for now, we only try to do, use the quadratic formula. I'm gonna come back to all these examples and do the graph later. But for now, let's do a couple of more examples. As you know, with math, it's always practice makes perfect. So another example would be x to the power 2 plus 2x is equal to 15. Okay, let's solve it together. So first thing first, I have to simplify it and rearrange it. So I bring everything to one side and equate it to 0. Then I identify a, b, c. A is 1, b is 2, c is -15. Now I just substitute it in the formula. -b plus and minus b squared minus 4 times 1, -15 over 2 times 1. Let's see if I can simplify it further. Under the radical, it's 4 plus 60, so 64. 64 divided by 2, which is -2 plus and minus 8 divided by 2. So the first root would be -2 plus 8 plus, add together is plus 6 over 2, which is 3. x2 is -2, -8 divided by 2, which is -5. So I have 2 different roots because under the radical, it's positive. So I have 2 roots which are different. They are not identical. So let's do one more example. Let's see, x to the power 2 plus 2x plus 1 equal to 0. Okay, so here again, all would go a is 1, b is 2, c is 1. So I just substituted in the formula directly. Minus b plus and minus b squared, which is 4 minus 4 times a c over 2 times a. So if you can see closely under the radical, it's 4 minus 4, which happens to be 0. So divided by 2. So I would have the final answer would be -1. As you can see, under the radical, it's equal to 0. So if you remember from the beginning, if under the radical it's equal to 0, I would have two identical roots. And this is exactly what happened here. So I have two roots, but both of them are happening at x equal to -1. Okay, so I can write it like this: x1 is -1, x2 is -1. All right, so let's do one more. Let's do one more. So for the next one, I'll go x2 plus 2x minus 1 equal to 0. It's very similar to this one. The only difference is that the c is -1. So a is equal to 1, b it's 2, c it's -1. Under the, let's see, let's substitute it in the formula, and then under the radical, it would be 4 minus 4 times a -1 over 2 times a. So here you would see that under the radical, it's positive. So we expect two different answers. So -2 plus and minus radical 8, which I tried to put it as 2 radical 2 over 2. So now I just simplify my answer and I skip a few steps. So that would be -1 plus radical 2, it's one answer. -1 minus radical 2, it's another answer. Okay. I hope it helps. Let me do another one, which under the radical is negative. This is the scenario. So I will explain. I will try to do one example in which b squared minus 4 times ac, it's less than 0, which in that case there should be no real roots. Let's do an example. Okay, so for this one, x to the power 2 minus 4x plus 5 is equal to 0. So as I told you, I like to be systematic when I'm doing math. So I just identify a, b, c. I just put it in the formula. Minus b plus and minus b squared minus 4 times a c over 2 times a. So let's simplify it a little bit further for plus and minus. Under the radical, it's 16 minus 20. Okay, so you can see now under the radical, it's, if you can see under the radical, it's -4, which is not acceptable. So here, in that case, we would conclude that there are no real roots and we don't continue solving the question. This is all about using the quadratic formula. These are the most simple cases. There are some other methods as well to find the quadratic, to solve the quadratic equations. But for now, for this video, we try to do only the quadratic formula. Please follow me for more videos, and solving quadratic formulas using perfect square and then factorizing. Thank you.